This happened a few months ago in the beginning of summer. I've held off on sharing it for so long because I didn't want to be judged for my actions. I joined a stupid online dating app. I was divorced last winter. Just kind of living it up, you know. I somehow matched with this man who lived in New York, an 8-hour drive from me. After texting for a few weeks, he sprung it on me that he was going to drive to see me. Since I'm staying with family since my divorce, I decided we'd get a hotel. He told me to find one, and he'd pay for it. I already felt super bad he was driving so far, so I was trying to find deals in the cheapest place that wasn't incredibly sketchy. I live about 45 minutes outside of the city in the state that I live in, and I'm not super familiar with some areas, so the hotel I booked ended up being no bueno. But I didn't know this until I got there. It was dark by the time I arrived after getting lost 4 times. There was a very shady motel across the street with 2 men smoking on the porch. Lots of trucks and truckers traveling through. I was just walking into the hotel like, oh, I messed up. But I just went with it anyways because I didn't really have a choice, and New York, what we'll refer to him as, was about an hour away, so he'd be there soon. The hotel was run by Jamaican people. I think a family, but this comes into play later, which is why I mention it. The woman who checked me in was nice, but the place threw off weird vibes. The lighting, the smell of bleach, the carpet, I don't know. It was really bright, but also really dark, if that makes sense. I started shaking as I was trying to check in. The reservation was under New York's name, and at first, she told me she couldn't find the reservation. His last name was Spanish, so I thought maybe I was pronouncing it wrong, even though I'm pretty good with Spanish. This made it awkward because now she knew I was meeting a stranger. I thought maybe he gave you the wrong name, she said. I nervously chuckled. She put me on the 2nd floor, and I was expecting an elevator, but as I turned, I saw that behind me was a huge carpeted staircase. This threw me off too, I don't know why. I get to my room and just pace around waiting for this stranger from the internet to show up. It starts raining. I'm sitting by the window sipping a glass of wine and see a pickup truck pull in. I think maybe it's him. A man in a black hoodie gets out and locks his truck about 50 times, hearing the beep beep go, and runs inside. I start panicking thinking it's him, and he has no bags or luggage because he's just going to come kidnap me or something. Then there's a loud knock at my door, and I jump so hard and immediately stand up. I make my way over to the door and look through the peephole. It's New York. No black hoodie, carrying bags. So I crack the door and smile, and he comes in, and I share my terrifying thoughts with him, and we chuckle. Then we get to business. Later that night, we fall asleep, and he's spooning me, but also has his arms all the way around me with his head on top of my head. Super weird, I don't know. I was woken up from a dead sleep just so sweaty because he was holding me so tightly, and I thought that's what had woken me, but then I heard it. Someone was messing with our door. Then I heard the handle start moving as whoever it was tried to open it, but it wouldn't open. Suddenly, New York jumps out of bed so fast I wondered how long he had been awake listening to this to react so quickly. I pull the covers up to my chin as he's just standing in the dark in his undies looking at the door. He looks to the people and says he thinks it's one of the Jamaican men who work here. We had a chain on the door as well as all the locks, so he kept the chain on as he opened it a few inches. Before he can even ask what the dude wanted, this man just says, "Is the white girl here?" I remember getting chills all over my body. New York says no and slams the door, almost completely unbothered by this. The man says something about needing a credit card from me. New York yells back that the room is on his card, under his name, and he'll take care of it in the morning. I looked at the clock, and it was like 2 a.m. I turn over and just stare at the wall, hoping to fall back asleep. New York wraps his arms around me again and is immediately snoring in my ear. Good thing he was hot. The next morning, we decided to go get breakfast. It's super early and we're both feeling groggy. I'm hoping as we round the corner to the stairs that no one is at the front desk because they definitely heard the noises from our room this morning and I was feeling really embarrassed. Thankfully, the front desk was empty. Then I saw him. An older black male, standing a few feet from the exit. I honestly don't know if he was Jamaican. I don't know if he was part of the family who owned this place or a guest or just someone else. I don't know. But his face was almost sunken in, and he had this weird, chilling look in his eyes. He was staring right at me. I knew without seeing him this was the guy from last night. New York whispers for me to just keep walking, so I break eye contact with this guy and lean into New York as we make our way to the exit. As we pass, the male is silent. Then, as I'm pushing open the door to exit the building, he starts saying, "There's the white girl. I found the white girl. She makes a lot of noise." And New York snorted. I was terrified. I left for work after breakfast. I was gone a few hours and returned to the hotel to find the room empty. I texted New York and asked where he was, and he texted back saying he was in the laundry room and that he'd be right back up. I sat down in the bed waiting for him. I heard some footsteps outside the door, the floor creaking, like someone was standing at the door, shifting their weight or something. I figured maybe New York forgot his room keys, so I got up to look through the peephole. But it was not him. The creepy man was standing outside the door, just staring into the peephole. I jumped back and started crying and called New York and yelled for him to come to the room quickly because the man was outside the door. He was gone by the time New York ran up. He went down to the front desk and spoke to the woman about this man, but she just kept saying she had no idea who he was talking about and that she will keep an eye out for him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just felt like I could feel him lingering around outside the door, but I was too scared to go look. New York was sleeping. I rolled over and decided to be the big spoon and wrap my arms around him. He was still basically a stranger, but was the most comforting thing I had. We checked out the next morning. I grabbed his hand as we made our way down the stairs because guess who was standing there? Yep. The woman from the front desk was gone, though, replaced by a younger male. The creepy man was smiling as we neared the bottom of the stairs, just this awful, bone-chilling grin. "Lucky man with the white girl," was the last comment we heard from this creep. New York spun around and gave him a few choice words and then walked me to my car. He waited while I drove off to make sure no one followed me. I don't know, maybe there's more we could have done, but again, he never did anything. It was just a very unnerving experience. About a month later, I was telling my dad about it, and he laughed and told me I had picked the worst part of the city, and that he thought that he had heard about this place being shut down multiple times for selling or trafficking. He couldn't remember, and then apparently it would just go under new ownership. This is a story from my childhood, one of the ones that haunt me to this day. Have you ever seen those memes where it says people react like a criminal when an unexpected visitor arrives on their doorstep? They freeze and drop everything they're doing and throw themselves to the floor to avoid being seen in a window. This is my story of how I became one of those people. At the time, I must have been around 7.5. I was visiting the Midwest, Kansas to be exact, from South Korea where I was born and raised, just visiting family, nothing major. On this particular night, the adults, our aunt and uncle, our parents, were visiting to have a date night. So our parents had ordered us pizza before they left and waited for it to arrive, for we wouldn't have to open the door for anyone. My aunt and uncle had 2 kids, 2 boys to be exact, and they were ages 15 and 8. Like I said before, I was maybe 7.5 at the time. My older sister was 11, and our baby brother was the young tender age of 3. So all in all, we're ready to just have a night of fun games. After all, it wasn't often the cousins got to get together like this. They lived in the States and we lived in Korea, but we loved each other dearly. We saw our parents out at the garage entryway. They made sure we knew the rules and we could recite them back to them. They also made sure we knew where the telephones were and the emergency numbers to accompany them. It's just going to be a typical night of no parents, or so we thought. It had maybe been an hour, maybe 2 after our parents had left. We were downstairs in the basement in the playroom or the game room, whatever people like to call it these days. We were down there just watching movies, playing air hockey, things of that nature, just being kids. We weren't being loud or anything like that, and even if we were, it wouldn't be too big of a deal because the way the houses were in Kansas, the basements are built into the ground in case of a tornado. I had gone upstairs with my oldest cousin because I wanted a drink of chocolate milk, and I couldn't reach the cups alone, so we wandered upstairs into the kitchen, which was on the far end of the house. The others stayed downstairs continuing their games. We had maybe been upstairs for 15 to 20 minutes because while I was drinking my milk, my older cousin was making snacks since we were planning to watch a movie. Then all of a sudden, we hear the doorbell ring. I remember my cousin looked at me and told me to stay here because it was odd that the doorbell was ringing. It wasn't late, but it certainly wasn't early. And I say this because it was summer, around 8 o'clock. My cousin started to creep towards the door quietly. It was unnerving for someone to be ringing the doorbell. We weren't expecting any guests, and the pizza had been delivered before our parents had even left for the evening. And before he's even halfway to the door, whoever's on the other side starts rapidly ringing the doorbell over and over, the constant ringing echoing throughout the house. And by this point, I had looked over toward the staircase, and I saw our other siblings starting to creep up the stairs, with the exclusion of the baby, who was still asleep in the crib down in the guest room. The oldest of the kids, James, put his finger to his lips and told us to be quiet to make it seem like no one was home, despite there being lights on. He crept closer to the door as the banging and ringing on the doorbell continues, and he peeked through the peephole. I had never seen my cousin look so freaked out. His face drained of color, and he backed away from the door rapidly, and he told us all to go down the stairs, but of course we didn't listen. Honestly, we thought he was just playing a joke. Maybe it was some of his friends wanting to scare us, since he did cancel his plans that night to stay home and watch all of us kids. My older sister shoved past him and looked through the peephole herself, and for whatever reason, whatever was on the other side of the door made her have the same exact reaction, and she stumbled back from the door just as pale. At the time, I didn't understand what was going on. I don't think any of us younger kids really did, but something wasn't right. After a while, about 20 minutes, whoever was at the door stopped ringing the doorbell and all was quiet. It seemed like they gave up. Maybe they thought no one was home. If only we knew how wrong we really were. We all sat in silence for a while after this initially occurred. My other cousin, who I'm just going to call Kyle for the purpose of the story, mustered up the courage to ask his brother James, who was at the door, and why James and my sister were acting so skittish. James told us that there was a man wearing dark clothes and seemed to be carrying some type of package or large box, but he couldn't see his face. Of course, Kyle, being the little smarty pants he was at the time, started to mock James, saying he was just being a scaredy cat and didn't recognize their neighbors. Kyle was convinced it was just a neighbor trying to drop off a package that might have got mixed up in the mail, seeing it happened all the time. So we all agree, and that was the probable cause, until we realized whoever was ringing the doorbell didn't just leave the package on the porch, which isn't that what most neighbors do? In the case no one answers, they'll just leave it. And why would they try to bring it over to the house at night instead of just waiting until the next day? But we thought it was over and done with, so we pushed it to the back of our minds. We didn't think it was important to call our parents and let them know what happened. It was over after all. We went back to the kitchen, grabbed the snacks, and started to head back downstairs until we heard banging again. But it wasn't from the front porch this time. We were in shock. We were frozen in fear. It was coming from right behind us. We turned slowly and looked back in the direction from which we came from. We were currently standing in the dining room. We had already passed through the kitchen. It was like someone was banging on the kitchen window. You know, the one that's typically above the sink, so your mother or father can watch the kids while they play in the backyard while they wash the dishes. So James and my older sister, who we're just going to call Nicole at this point, got down on their hands and knees, and they crawled back into the kitchen, much against our charging. Just as quickly as they crawled into the kitchen to take a peek, they crawled back to us, almost in hyper speed, and they told us to get low and stay low as we crawled into the den further down the hallway. James had all of us huddled close to the fireplace out of sight from the windows. He told us to stay there. He was taking charge. He was protecting his home and his family the best he knew how. James quickly crawled away. I didn't know where he was going, but I was scared. The banging was getting louder and it was getting closer and closer. At some point, I started to cry, and I remember Kyle put his hand over my mouth and my sister was hugging us tight. And around that time, we saw James starting to appear back around the corner, and he had his baseball bat. He had crawled up another staircase to get to his room. He crawled past us and put a finger to his lips again, and that's when we realized he was crawling towards the doggy door. He was attempting to close off the one entrance to the house that wasn't locked. Thankfully, he managed to get it latched in time because we don't think the man outside had realized that the house had a doggy door. But when he heard the lock click into place, the banging became more erratic, more violent. Then, all of a sudden, much like before, the banging stopped, but we heard pacing. Someone was walking back and forth across the porch, slowly, deliberately. Thump, 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 as heavy boots thundered across the red oak porch. And then, without warning, the pacing stopped, and it became quiet, eerily quiet. Then the man called out, "Won't you open the door? I have a package for you." We didn't respond. We stayed quiet, or as quiet as we could with the way our hearts were pounding and with how ragged our breathing was. The stranger called out again, "Open the door." And again we didn't answer. The man called out angrily, "I said open the door, I have a package." Like before, we didn't answer, nor did we make any sudden movements. The man started banging again, this time directly on the panel window of the room we were sitting in, yelling, "I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Open the door, or I'll open it for you." Bang, 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 the window rattled and shook violently with each impact from the strange man. Thankfully, our cousin's house had reinforced windows, so they weren't easy to break, but unluckily, we didn't have any neighbors close by, so we didn't think anyone could hear the commotion. But while he was making all this noise, we took the opportunity to book it into another room to get a phone. At one point, while we were on the phone with the police officers, they asked if we could describe the man, and all we knew was that he was tall and wearing black. So Kyle and I decided to be brave, so if something did happen to us that night, they would at least have a better description of who did it. We crawled back into the den and we dared to look out of a small corner of the window. We gently moved the curtains out of the way, and lo and behold, the man was still banging. He had moved the shutters off outside the window. They're basically hanging off their hinges at this point, rattling with the wind. We made eye contact with the deranged man. Direct, soul-searching eye contact. I don't think before this night I had ever believed that there is pure evil in this world, but when I looked into that man's eyes, I didn't see a soul. I know it sounds crazy, but those were not the eyes of a human. He was something unlike anything I've ever seen before. Animalistic. Maybe the only word I could describe it as is demonic. It was evil, unnatural, and something I never want to see again. When he saw us, he smiled a twisted grin that I'm sure he thought was reassuring, and he crouched down, for he could get a better look at us, I assume, and then he said, "Don't you want your mail?" "You have mail. I can give it to you if only you would open the door." I remember just grabbing onto Kyle's hand for dear life. Kyle shook his head no, and he threw the curtain back over the window, and before we even had a chance to move any further, the man started violently banging on the window again. At this point, James had had enough. He passed the phone to my sister and he yelled, "Leave us alone. The police are on their way. You're not getting in here." After that, it seemed like the man panicked. The banging abruptly stopped, and then we heard rapid footsteps on the porch. And Kyle and I peeked out the window again, and the man was running through the yard, past all the trees, and he jumped the fence, the wooden 22-foot fence at the end of the yard, into the alley that separated the neighborhood from the old cemetery. We stayed on the phone with the police until they arrived, and our parents arrived not long after, but the man was never caught, and we don't know what happened after that night. He just disappeared into thin air. To this day, I'm now 21. When the doorbell rings when I'm not expecting a visitor, my heart stops and I break out into a cold sweat. At this point in time, I just picked my mental health back up after an extremely traumatic, unconsensual episode. You can guess what? And was still struggling with the chronic inability to say no to people. I'm a 21-year-old trans man, and while I never have trouble passing, I'm still seen as very pretty and young-looking. So I was at a young people's event at my place of worship, which is completely accepting of all strokes of people, by the way. It was a lovely evening. I met a lot of great people, got a bit tipsy, and had a great time. This is until around 12:45 to 1 a.m. when things started to wind up. I went upstairs and met a man, looked approximately in his late 30s, called Tobias. Tobias was quite forward, complimenting my appearance, being familiar, asking about all sorts of personal things, so I guessed that he was interested, but I didn't feel the same way. My place of worship has always been a safe place for me, so I assumed if I didn't flirt back, he'd get the message. Mea culpa. Shortly after, I went downstairs to put something in the bin, and he followed me. When we were alone, he kissed me. I pulled away and told him, "I'm sorry, I'm not available." He said, "Don't worry, neither am I," and gestured to his wedding ring. I laughed it off, turned, and walked back upstairs, and as we walked, Tobias told me, "I can't believe I just did that. Nothing happened. That just didn't happen." I nodded and thought that was that. The evening was getting late. I decided to get home. I offered to walk a friend of mine to the station, and when she left to go to the bathroom, he asked where I was going. I said firmly, "I'm going to walk my friend to the station, and then I'm going home." She returned, and as we left, he decided to come along with us. I asked where he was headed. He said, "Oh, I'll go to the station for you." I reiterated that I was going straight home from that point. Along the way, my friend wanted to get another drink and hang out, and I agreed. We were chatting, all seemed friendly, but I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable at Tobias's behavior. He was constantly complimenting me, telling me I was amazing, special, not like anyone he'd met, and kept touching me, putting his hands on my neck, down the back of my shirt, and kept trying to kiss me. FYI, this tactic is called love bombing, and is a big old red flag. He commented on some hickeys I had. "Who was that? Who scarred you? Whoever it was, you think they're better than me? Really, better than me? You let a boy do that to you?" I told him it was someone that I had known for a long time and reminded him that I wasn't single. He had kissed me around 4 times up to this point, and when he did, I would pull away, try and put distance between us, move my head so he wouldn't, laugh awkwardly, say, "We're in a shop, please don't. I'm not what you're looking for. You don't know me," etc. This man straight up tried to make out with me 1 meter away from some poor shopkeeper serving us. Oh my God. He squeezed my waist and commented on how skinny and small I was, asked me how old I was, and commented, "Wow, you look so young. You look like you're 17. He asked me if I was attracted to him, and I shrugged, shook my head, and said, "Sorry, I'm very into the person I'm with, and I can't even look at anyone else when I like someone." At this point, I should have told him to buzz off. In fact, should have said that a long time before, but when it's actually happening, it's surprisingly difficult to get a bearing on when you can start being rude, which is exactly what people who behave like this rely on, a vulnerable person's fears of making a scene, or else they actually believe that this behavior means the person wants to be persuaded. Yuck. We all decided to sit on a bench as all the pubs were shutting down. I sat on the end and my friend next to me. Tobias whined that I wasn't sitting next to him. My friend asked why that mattered, and he said, "Oh, because I want him to..." Never mind. I'm being too much. I'm going too far. I tried to steer the conversation away from him flirting, but he kept standing and walking to where I was sitting to kiss me, crouching by me and putting his hands on my knees. He didn't want to tell us how old he was because he was afraid I wouldn't like him, but did eventually confess he was 37. In an attempt to stop him from being interested in me, I revealed that I was trans, and he put his hand up my shirt saying, "Wow, you really think I would judge you for that? You have no idea who I am. I see you." Side note, what was that? An Avatar reference? I would never care. I'd still do everything with you. I wiggled away as far as I was able and said something along the lines of, "Well, thank you, but I'm not interested." My friend had somehow misread the situation as me enjoying this behavior, probably because I'm a bloke. I texted another friend to call me so that I could get 5 minutes away from the situation, walked up the street, explained everything, and made a plan, which was a really good idea. Talking out loud about it, I finally registered that this wasn't right, and that I was totally in the right to be uncomfortable and wanting to get out. I returned and told everyone that I was going home. The second I came back, he tried to kiss me and told me he was worried and had tried to come looking for me. I moved my head so he couldn't and told him, "Please don't. I'm going home." I texted the friend that I was with help, and she immediately started saying that we were going home, he should go home too, and that her and I were leaving together now. He asked me, "What's changed? You've come back different. Who are you talking to? What's going on?" I told him, "I'm uncomfortable and I'm going home now." He said, "What are you talking about? Have I made you uncomfortable?" "Yes, I'm going home now." At this point, I can definitely see that my lack of rudeness and conflict avoidance tactics had actually made the situation worse, and given him the impression that I could be persuaded to do whatever he wanted, or somehow had led him on. So now that I've been absolutely crystal clear, he should back off, right? Wrong. He said, "Wow, who were you talking to? What's happened? Whoever it is, don't throw this away. I know we had a connection. You're so special." I said, "I only met you this evening. You made me feel uncomfortable and you should ask people before you kiss them." "Wow. I can't believe this. You're trying to turn this around on me?" "I know you're drunk. It's fine. I just want to go home now." I'm completely sober. I'm not drunk at all." At this point, my friend stepped in and tried to assure him everything was fine and convince him to go home. He asked me for one last kiss, and I shook my head. "No, thank you." He said, "Don't throw this away," and he tried to touch my face. I reiterated, "I met you this evening. I don't know you. I want to go home." He said, "Can I at least have a hug?" and immediately tried to hug me. I pushed him away and said, "I would rather not." He responds, "Wow, you're making me feel uncomfortable now." I said I would rather not. Just please respect my boundaries. I want to go home." My friend again tried to get him to go home, and he responds, "No, you're making me feel like I've done something wrong. I just want a hug. Oh, I know what this is. You're just not used to people accepting you for who you are. You can't handle that I accept you and see you for who you really are." I said, "That's not the case. I've had plenty of people who accept me, but you've made me feel uncomfortable, and I'm going home." At this point, I stood up, backed against the edge of the bench with him standing barely a foot away. I had started shaking because I was feeling anxious, so I just walked away up the street. My friend stayed with him, convincing him to go home. He didn't follow us. I took her to the station and got myself an Uber. Next day, he handed a report very similar to this into the security at my place of worship, and the dude was promptly barred from entry. I hope people can see the mechanisms of how this situation was set up and can find confidence to be far more outspoken than I was, because being polite, I made the situation worse. I know it's not my fault, but I'm very grateful that I'm not timid like I used to be, and am able to be absolutely firm and, if needs be, rude about setting my boundaries. Therapy is one heck of a drug, and it's doing me wonders. This happened a long time ago, when I was around 15 or so. I'm 25 now. Back then, I was really into singing and dancing with my friends, and I was introduced to K-pop as a result. This was way before K-pop became noticeably mainstream, so whenever events relating to it came up, we got very excited. There was a global audition for one of the big companies in my town, and my 3 friends and I decided to go. I was the only non-Asian girl in our friend group. I'm only mentioning it because this pertains to the story later. The K-pop fandom back then was pretty much the same as now. People of various ethnicities were into the idol music genre. We all knew the likelihood of getting into the industry was super low, and for me even more so, as I wasn't of Asian descent, but I knew that going in. That wasn't the point of us going, though. We just loved being in proximity of something important to the genre we enjoyed. Just kids having fun. By the way, I looked pretty young for my age then, and wearing pigtails this day didn't help with that either. So we get dropped off and meet up at the audition place, a community center of some sort. We kind of dilly-dally around a bit until we have a lineup for our respective auditions, i.e. singing, dancing. I was going to go sing, so I was mentally preparing myself in the crowded space outside of the audition rooms. That's when out of the corner of my eye, I see a tall, older, 40s maybe, white man begin to approach me. I remember thinking, is he going to audition too? It was strange because everyone else in there was younger, maybe he was a parent. He walks up pretty close and goes, "Can you help me please?" I'm confused and I ask him what he needs help with. The staff here, my son. My son's trying to audition, but they won't let him audition. Okay, this is weird. I then asked him why, and he responds, "Because he's not Korean." That was when I started to get creeped out. I looked around to see a pretty diverse crowd and then back at him. I don't know. That's terrible. You should talk to... And then I point towards the staff. They should be able to help. I knew he was messing around, but I was too scared to say anything else. I went on. Anyone can audition here. He didn't listen and insisted on me helping him. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. When I was trying for the 5th time to convince him to approach the staff instead of me, he beckoned me to come outside with him. "My son's just outside my car. Can you come talk to him, please?" That was when I repeated what I said earlier and began to firmly walk in the opposite direction. He kept trying to coax me out to see his son. I managed to lose him in the crowd of people. Only seconds later, I see him talking to my friend about me and helping his son and all that. I was shocked. The man had clearly been watching me for a while to know who I came with. We were split up at that point. I went up and told him we should get going without looking at the man. He ignored me and kept on talking to her. Without speaking, I went up to her, grabbed her hand, and pulled at her once to get her away from him. She was super gullible and didn't understand why I was so worried. The man clearly was unnerved by what I did and left my friend and then disappeared into the crowd. So about 20 minutes later, I'm in the lineup for the audition when I get a cold feeling in my body, and I turn to look towards the entrance. My audition room was close to it, and there he was, standing. But he wasn't just standing. He had his arms crossed and he was glaring at me. I've never seen someone look at me with such vitriol. He looked like he wanted to harm me. It was terrifying. The crowd of people was sparse because we had all lined up outside our assigned rooms. The man waited there, staring at me non-stop for an hour. An hour. He glared at me all the way until I got into the audition room. I was so scared that he'd be there once I got out, but I guess the auditions went on longer than he expected and he went home, with his son in tow, I'm guessing. It all started about a month ago. as I was sitting out on my front porch having a cigarette, and a random man pops up from around my bushes and walks right up to me. He's pretty tan, slim, but fit build to him, probably about 5'7". Walks up and casually says, "Hey, I couldn't bother you for one of those, right?" It was random at the time, but I didn't mind. I pulled another smoke out, handed it to him, and offered my lighter if he needed it. "Nah, don't worry, Sarge. I don't need it." As soon as he said that, he turned around, placed the cigarette into the branches on the bush, and walked across the street to the house that faces us. I sat there quietly as he did all of this. Why would he ask me for a smoke and then put it in my bush and walk away? Weird. But I don't live in the best areas, so I took the smoke and went back inside. Little did I know that that wasn't going to be the last time he does something strange. 2 weeks pass without any problems. My sister brings my niece and nephew over for my mother and I to watch them one Friday afternoon. We got them to settle down to a movie when the dogs start towards the door. Their hair is standing on the backs of their necks, but they weren't barking. I shoo them away from the front door since they're known for getting excited about anything they hear out front. No sooner did I turn my back to the door, 2 knocks thump the front door behind me. I slowly open the door and see the cigarette guy standing on my porch, a wide grin plastered across his face. I open the screen door and step out in front of him. Now let me clarify. I'm a giant. I'm 6'5", 300 pounds, and have some martial arts background behind me. But when I stood there in front of him, my fight or flight response went haywire. I felt the blood rush out of my head and hands into my feet, which is something I rarely felt before. He sat there, smiling, doing nothing else. I ask him if I can help him. He reaches into his pockets and pulls out a pack of Camels and opens them towards me. There's 3 cigarettes poking out. "Hey, Sarge, want a cig?" Why does he keep calling me Sarge? I tell him I'm good, I have my own smokes, and it looks like he's almost out anyways. His smile vanishes instantly. His eyes seem to completely glaze over. I want out. It caught me by surprise. Everything. I want out. Tango out. He starts rocking back and forth, repeating I want out and tango out. I can't begin to tell you the thoughts that were going through my head at this point. I'm speechless. "Hey, Sarge, can you get me out of everything? The military, the FBI, make it all go away. Please, sir." At that moment, I remember that my mother, niece, and nephew are right on the other side of the door, and this guy seems like he's about to lose it. Without a second thought, I place my hand on his shoulder. This stopped him from rocking. I asked him if everything is okay. He stares back at me for a while before another smile breaks over his face. "Hey. Yeah. He turns his attention towards my front window. The blinds are shut, but he's focused heavily on them. As I noticed this and was about to say something, "Gotta get back to field. Tango out." He pulled away and sprinted his way across the street to the house. I stood there, dumbfounded. I couldn't believe what was just happening in those short couple of minutes. I hop inside and lock the door. My mom is staring at me confused, so I tell her about everything that just happened. The weird thing is, we know the woman who lives across the street. She lives alone. Where did this guy come from? My mother and I decide to call him Tango Out after this incident. Here's the part that really sent me over the edge with this guy. We got a hold of the woman across the street and got some information about him. He's the son of her friend. They haven't been able to find a place to live. He's apparently an extreme paranoid schizophrenic. He's never been in the military, nor the FBI. His mother has no idea how his mental state deteriorated to such a severe degree. She assured us that he's harmless and that he is only a danger to himself. Well, last week, my mother and her boyfriend decided to go hang out with some family, so I was home alone with my 2 dogs. I don't usually watch Netflix, but I heard Invader Zim had a new movie, so I sat on the living room sofa and was there for about an hour and a half. The entire time I was watching, which was about 11:30 p.m. to 12:45 a.m., I kept seeing something outside my front window out of the corner of my eye. My dogs made no movement, and it was quite windy, so I brushed it off as moving trees or something. I finished the movie and flipped the TV off. I stand to stretch, and once again I catch something out of the corner of my eye. This time, though, my dogs went straight to the door and stood at alert. I was about to go out for a smoke anyways, so I make my way to the window to show my dogs that Mom and Dad weren't home yet. That's when I saw him, standing on my porch staring at my front door. Once again, my fight-or-flight response exploded, way more than the first time. I snuck my way to the front door and quietly turned the deadbolt and handle locks. I didn't want him to hear me. I can see out of my blinds, but only a little bit. He's still standing there, not moving an inch, wearing a white tank top and probably his boxers. I was dead focused on him. I was trying to figure out if I was going to have to confront this man. He's never been mean or angry towards us. I have no bad things to say about him, since I understand he's not all there. But this was too bizarre. He had to have been standing there the entire time I was watching that movie, maybe even longer. I walked to my room and place a couple shells next to my shotgun just in case. I call my mother's phone as I stare back out to see what he's doing, but he's not there. I scan over the yard, but I don't see him anywhere. When she answers, I tell her what Tango Out is doing, and she hands the phone to her boyfriend. He makes sure I've got my gun ready in case he tries to go hostile. They'll be home in a half an hour. I said that's okay and hang up the phone. I press 911 on my ringer to be ready at a moment's notice, and that's when I look back out the peak spot of my window and he's standing there, staring at me. I doubt he was able to actually see me, but it made me jump back and duck below the window. I scrambled to grab my phone that fell when I jumped. That's when 2 little knocks happen on the front door. I freeze entirely. 2 more little knocks follow. I separate my blinds just enough for me to see his face. He has a simple, calm expression on his face, but I can see tears pouring down his face with swollen eyes. I was just about to hit dial to call 911 when, from around the corner, 2 officer units with flashing lights pulled up in front of my house. I'm still shocked. Someone must have seen him and called the cops before I did. I see Tango Out, turn around and stare at the lights, then he casually walked over to them. I open my blinds to see 2 officers grab him and immediately start to search and question him. After a moment, making sure the cops had him under control, I came out and stood on my patio and stared at them. I lit a cigarette since my nerves were all over the place, and waited for one of the cops to walk over and talk to me. They have had to wrangle him up from multiple places around the neighborhood and have even seen him break into people's garages and sleep there for the night just to be discovered the next morning. They ask if I'm fine. I say yes. They make a couple of comments about he was about to break into a lair of a giant. They ask if I want to press charges, but I say no since I know he's a paranoid schizophrenic and he's not able to control himself all the time. They took him back across the street to his mother. His parents came back shortly after, and the night kind of ended there. I woke up the next day to find multiple cans of food spread out all over my front yard. Maybe it was Tango Out's way of saying sorry. I rounded them up and placed them on our property and went to work. Since then, we hadn't had an issue with Tango Out. I see him once in a while walking down the street. I guess the cops are going to help his mother get them into suitable living and him into a hospital for the help he needs. But he hasn't come back onto our property since that night. I'm still a little nervous going out for a smoke, though. My first month, I sputtered through a series of odd jobs, casually drifting from one gig to another as I tried to figure out what I really wanted out of my life. Eventually, an acquaintance suggested that I try bartending. At the time, I had no experience at all, but I thought, whatever, why not put yourself out there? Couldn't hurt to try. I applied to all the LGBT bars in town. I'm gay, by the way. I figured that a job at one of these places would be a good way to integrate myself into the community, maybe even meet some guys without having to resort to Grindr and the like. I quickly hit it off with the owner of a neighborhood pub, and He hired me on the spot, promising to mentor me in all things booze-related. The following months were some of the best of my life. Met a lot of good people and gained a lot of perspective. I'm now starting grad school, but I still work at that same bar a couple of nights a week. That's where the following incident occurred. A few months ago, I should mention that this bar is on the corner of a main road and a quiet side street. It's important. Anyway, around 5:45 p.m., I parked my car halfway down the side street, which at the time was lined with cars, and I walked back to the pub. After taking some deep breaths and doing some quick mental prep, despite the nature of my job, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool introvert, I walked through the front door, tossed my car keys into my knapsack, and tossed my knapsack over the main bar. It's my routine, what I always do. Only bartenders are ever allowed behind the bar, and I've never really felt the need to lock my personal belongings in the back office. It's just not that kind of place. Almost all of the patrons are quality people. Hard workers, community members, younger, older, everything in between. People who generally deserve a break every now and then, if only in the form of a cocktail or three. That being said, it's not cheers. Admittedly, this job has really made me wise to what so many women must have to endure on a regular basis. Not everyone is respectful of personal boundaries, especially when you're new, fresh meat. I've been leered at. I've had guys reach out and run their hands through my hair, stroke my chest, squeeze things, and forcibly pull me closer and whisper me all the things they'd like to do, only to get righteous and angry when I don't enthusiastically reciprocate. My first week, my boss told me half-jokingly that this is a gay bar, but there's no such thing as harassment. I guess because they're dudes and I'm dudes and we're all dudes and I'm supposed to man up and deal with it, which, for the most part, I do and did. The money's consistently good, but I still can't say that I'm entirely comfortable with it. Double standards suck. Monday evenings can be hit or miss. That one Monday was a miss. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, only a couple of folks remained. That's when Vern walked in. I guess that Vern was in his mid to late 30s. Solid build, clean-shaven, average-looking, sort of impeccably anonymous. I've never seen him before. He sat down at the end of the counter on the very last stool, next to where I enter and exit from behind the bar and where I usually leave my belongings. He ordered a soda and introduced himself, and we made small talk for a few minutes. He seemed to be a pretty affable guy, and nothing about him seemed explicitly out of the ordinary, but admittedly something about him didn't quite sit right with me. He almost seemed a little too ordinary, like conspicuously so. He was dressed up as dressed down, if that makes sense. It's hard to describe. Think along the lines of someone who might spend an hour trying to style perfect bedhead. Anyway, at some point the topic got around to video games, which I love, and for a good 10 minutes we discussed some upcoming releases we were both apparently excited for. Eventually I had to excuse myself to help another customer as well as finish a couple of other tasks that still needed doing. But Vern said it was no big deal and of course I needed to do my job. Cool, no problem. As I walked around the pub, cleaning this and that, I couldn't help but notice that whenever I happened to look in Vern's direction, he was already looking at me. This is something I've gotten used to as a bartender, but again, something in particular just didn't sit right. Sometimes he would look away, but most of the time he wouldn't, giving me a tiny, impenetrable smile. This went on for a while, nearly 2 hours. I'd walk up to him occasionally, ask him if he needed anything, and we'd have a brief exchange. I'd go back to my other duties. He'd just keep on staring, and so on and so on. In all that time, he only ordered one more soda, and he didn't talk to anyone else. He had his smartphone on the counter in front of him, but I never once saw him looking at it. As I said before, I've experienced worse, so I figured that he was probably socially awkward or maybe just lonely. Whatever he was, though, he wasn't particularly subtle. By midnight, Vern was the only person still sitting at the bar. There were 2 guys playing pool in the back room, out of sight, and a few guys smoking on the patio, but Vern and I were the only ones in the main room. In that sort of situation, it'd feel rude to not just chat up the only person left in the vicinity. It's part of my job to make people feel welcome after all. But despite it being a super slow night, I felt drained and I just couldn't find the energy to strike up a genuine conversation with someone who was making me feel like I was on full display. I figured it would be a good time to go to the storeroom and grab a few cases of beer that I had to restock soon anyways. I excused myself and told Vern that I was going to the office and would be right back, but if he needed anything, he could holler. When I made it inside the office, I immediately felt a sense of relief, like I'd finally made it backstage after a gruelingly long performance. It took me about 30 seconds to grab the stuff I needed, but I decided to sit down and mess around on my phone for a few minutes, enjoying my solitude. I stayed there until it felt like I'd been away from my post for a bit too long, at which point I grabbed the beer cases and headed back to the bar. To my surprise, Vern was gone by the time I got back, and there was just a $20 bill under his glass. I felt suddenly guilty, not because I just made money off of him, though of course that was appreciated, but because maybe he really was just some closeted dude who didn't know how to interact with other guys, and maybe the money was his only reliable way of expressing gratitude for the company. Maybe I had misread the cues and was projecting my own insecurities onto his admittedly awkward behavior. Maybe. In any case, he was gone now, and I still had more to do, so I placed the cash in my tip jar and mentally thanked him for it. I began going about my tasks for the rest of the shift and quickly put Vern out of my head. A couple of hours later, around 1 a.m., I escorted the final stragglers outside and closed the front door. I work alone on Monday nights, so it usually takes me a little less than an hour to finish my tasks after closing. As per usual, I put on some chill music and went on autopilot. I finished everything around 2 a.m. After turning off the last few lights, I grabbed my knapsack, set the alarm, headed out the front door, which locks on its own. I started to amble down the street towards my car, the only one left on the block. All I could think about was how badly I needed to pack a bowl and jump in the shower. When I reached the back door of my car, I absent-mindedly yanked it open and threw my knapsack into the back seat. Slammed the door closed, I stepped out to the driver's side door and pulled the handle and climbed inside. Only my butt made contact with the seat, and I reached my hand toward the open door did I realized I hadn't taken my keys out of my bag. I never actually unlocked my car. A wave rolled over me like I had jumped into the ocean, and I saw something in the periphery of my vision. I kid you not. There he was, just sitting there, in my passenger seat. I'm not at all ashamed to admit I screamed. The driver's side door was still open, but I didn't and couldn't move. I just stared at him, dumbfounded. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," Vern said. I didn't immediately respond, so he quickly followed up with, "I thought we could hang out, maybe play some games together." Then, like it was nothing, he handed me my car keys, which he had obviously stolen out of my bag during those minutes I was in the office, and apologized again, presumably for having my keys in the first place. Then he offhandedly gave me an address and said that he didn't live far away, if I was interested. I'd like to say that I was this close to grabbing him by the collar and beating the life out of him, but something in my gut urged me strongly to play along, to pretend like this situation wasn't completely insane. The street was deserted. I had no idea if he was armed, how unhinged he was, etc. Too many variables. "No worries, man," I said casually, like he was just an old childhood friend who'd just flown into town to surprise me on my birthday. "Just wasn't expecting to see you." I had no idea what I should say. It might have been a stupid decision on my part, and there was probably 1001 things I should have done instead, but I tried to genuinely meet him halfway and just be as gracious as possible, as calmly as possible. "That sounds cool, but it was a crazy long night for me and I'm really tired. Can we rain check?" A few silent moments passed, but I suppose I sounded genuine enough because he crossed his arms and simply said, "Okay." I asked him if he had his car parked nearby, and he said no. I didn't press the issue further, and, again dumb, I told him outright that I'd be happy to drop him off at his place, at which point we could trade numbers and make plans in the morning after I'd gotten some sleep. Somehow, appeasement seemed safer than flat-out confrontation or running away, or suggesting Uber or whatever. I didn't want to offend him or make him feel like he was in the wrong. I have no idea what he was capable of, whether he was actually malevolent or just an alien from another social dimension. He quietly agreed to ride. It was the longest 10 minutes of my life. On the way, I asked him about how his day went and what games he liked and other random nonsense. I mentioned multiple times that I was really glad to meet another gamer and that it'd be fun to share the hobby with someone else. Basically, I said whatever it took to keep the conversation light and flowing, but he didn't say much at all aside from occasionally directing me left and right, and whatever he said had a sort of petulant tone to it. I felt like I was driving home a psychotic toddler whom I just refused McDonald's. He looked out the passenger window the entire ride. Occasionally I would glance over at him, but mostly I tried to keep my eyes forward because I found that focusing on the road made me feel more centered. Of course, a part of me wishes now that I had acted more assertively, whipping around in a sharp turn and sending him flying effortlessly out the window. You know, something hardcore. But being friendly and accommodating was really the only thing that seemed appropriate at the time. My grandfather says, kill him with kindness, and I disagree that that's always the correct solution, but it's what I did that night, and it worked. I considered driving directly to a police station, but I wasn't terribly familiar with the neighborhood, and I didn't want to rile him up by taking out my phone. Before long, we arrived. The destination was a small park in a suburb that I'd only driven through a couple of times previously. He said he'd walk the rest of the way, and at his request, I brought the car to a stop on the corner. There was a short, somewhat terrifying lull before either of us said anything or made any sort of move. I offered to put my number in his phone, but he refused and simply said thanks and got out of the car. As soon as he closed the door, I hightailed it down the street. I drove aimlessly for about a mile before I pulled over and just idled on the side of a main road. I sat in silence for a few minutes and then called my boss, who at this point is a good friend. Honestly, I didn't care that it was after 2 a.m. at that point. He picked up after a couple of rings, and I quickly regurgitated everything that had happened. He was a good sport about it and didn't just play it off for laughs, instead expressing legitimate concern. We had a mandatory staff meeting that week in which everyone was told they needed to be on guard and how the bar would be installing several cameras for extra security. Thankfully, I haven't seen Vern again since that night, nor have any of the other bartenders. So this story isn't very long at all, but it's the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. It was my senior year of high school and pretty late in the school year. I think it was March, maybe February. Anyways, I had just got to school. It was before classes had even started, so I was just sitting in the commons with my friends. I remember hearing an announcement over the intercom, but I'm hard of hearing, so I didn't understand it at all. I figured it was important, so I go back to talking. My friends didn't understand it either, so we just kept all talking. Everyone started shuffling around and I got kind of confused. Did the bell ring? No, it's only 7:35. We had 5 more minutes. Then the ladies from the office came and told us to hurry into a classroom. I asked why and she said just go as she pushed me into the choir room. My friend was already in there and I asked her what was going on. We're on lockdown. Didn't you hear the announcement? Locks lights out of sight. My heart dropped. Lockdown? I was so scared I thought I was going to die. Or worse, one of my friends. Then I saw another friend crying. I went over to comfort her and she said she couldn't find her boyfriend before she got pushed in here, and he isn't texting back and she was so worried. I sat down and started to cry myself. I texted my mom to let her know what was going on, and then I turned my phone on Do Not Disturb and sat in the dark, quiet room. A few minutes go by and I hear footsteps outside. My heart is beating out of my chest and tears are rolling down my face. By now it's probably 9 a.m. The door opens and I brace myself. It was thankfully the principal, there to tell us that everything is okay and we can go to class. No one got hurt and all was okay, but it truly was the scariest experience of my life. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located on both Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you really listen to the podcasts, you know what I mean? Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.